If during the Q&A time, someone would like to not be recorded, send me a message and I'm glad to pause the recording during your section of the Q&A time. So again, Amanda McMillan-LeCue here. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology here at Drexel University, and we are delighted for our sociology colloquium to have Raoul Liévanos here with us from the University of Oregon, where he's an associate professor. He researches broadly environmental sociology intersecting with urban issues of injustice, equity, and race. And our department here is really pleased to bring him to speak, virtually bring him to speak, because it helps us as a department think through the intersection of those facets with our own students and with our own research, really focusing on urban issues, public health, and environmental climate crises specifically. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the reins over to Raoul and let him present on his recent work on Riskscapes. And then we'll have a moderated Q&A time once he wraps up, where we can engage further and really try to grapple with the information he's providing us from his research today. All right, with that, Raoul, I'll let you share the screen and take it from here.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, we're kind of constrained in this context. So I saw some familiar faces. It's great to be interacting with folks at Drexel again. It's been a while. And so I'm going to be sharing kind of an outline of sociological research agenda I've been putting together over the last, I guess, 10 years now, and also providing some insights from some research that I've been conducting with some colleagues as well. And let's see. Just before I get going, I just want to provide some acknowledgements. So once upon a time in Philadelphia, I was working as a lecturer in the department of what was then the Culture and Communication, and also at the Center for Public Policy. I was working on my doctorate at that time, and my partner and I were living in Pennsylvania, and there came an opportunity to lecture in both of those units. At the same time, received some research support from the Chemical Heritage Foundation. And so in those contexts, Jody Roberts, Gwen Ottinger, and Richardson Dilworth were really helpful in providing a PhD candidate, someone who's dissertating, some funds and teaching experience where I had a lot of research experiences at University of California, Davis, where I earned my doctorate, but I didn't have much teaching experiences at all. And so that time at Drexel was really formative. I produced some earlier publications, mostly in the realm of science and technology studies or the political sociology of science. And so that, I got to meet Kelly, and see you here today, Kelly, and some other folks along the way that really kind of, that was pretty influential kind of intellectual development stage in my career. And so I was really appreciative of that time. And then, of course, Amanda and Rachel, thank you for bringing me into the colloquium and helping me navigate the administrative logistics and all those kind of things. I really appreciate it. And this work, yeah, thank you.
Hey, Raoul, your microphone is cutting in a little bit.
Okay.
So I just wanted to touch on that because I want to make sure we can hear everything you say.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'll try to, how's this? Does this sound okay?
Yeah, currently it sounds pretty good.
Okay, I'll try to keep it that. And then folks at UC Davis, Washington State University, and University of Oregon, who I've been working with over the years, and shown there on the slide, just and the funding and support that they've provided throughout this research has been greatly appreciated. So I want to get started here in the introduction and more of the substantive comments here, and we'll talk a little bit about crisis and risk and things that we're probably well attuned to and thinking about various forms of crises around us today. When we think about its origins of the term, some historians note that it has these Greek origins related to sift or to decide. And really, they are seen as situations in which people, the significance of people and events is brought to light, right? And it's these crucial kind of, as we think more sociologically, these historical moment of rupture and intervention and a framed event, right? That they can be exploited by elites to advance their agendas, as Gotham and Greenberg have looked at in their work on crisis-driven urbanization, and really where there's a breakdown in the routines that we have established and prevailing social order to some extent, right? And often it's been used as critical moments where elites can intervene and advance their agendas. But it's also points at contestation, right, where a new definition of the situation can emerge, often around how we interpret the events and circumstances around us, and to the extent that we can. Within kind of refining that understanding, urban sociologists have been for quite some time thinking and studying various forms of urban crisis, right? The desertion of the city by the state, municipal fiscal insolvency, concentrated crime, poverty, unemployment, and housing insecurity, all matters of concern here, as well as persistent segregation and devaluation of people of color. As we move forward, right, we have work on that. That's been a key concern within urban sociology, but now increasingly so, right, concerns about the climate crisis and framed as a climate emergency by the UN. Most recently, right, is a race we're losing, but is a race we can win. It's being framed as. Their outline of that emergency, right, rising global temperatures, food and water insecurity, more frequent and intense climate and weather extremes, particularly related to sea level rise, which I'll be talking about today a little bit, and also a major threat to international peace and security. Right, but nonetheless, it's a race we can win, even though that we're losing. It's often framed as, and in very global terms. But what the situation brings about is right, threat of loss of lives and livelihoods, right, that we see all around the world around us. And within sociology, we see that there's right, a prominent sociological framework developed by Ulrich Beck, known as the Risk Society. We can kind of more of a textbook definition you would potentially get in your undergraduate courses, right? It's a society that creates risky practices and technologies while being increasingly concerned with mitigating and or preventing exposure to such risks, which tend to accumulate at the lower levels of our social stratification system. That was some of the initial kind of articulations of the risk society. But as Beck was developing his framework further and others elaborated on it, there's these ideas about a world risk society. And as we see in the context of climate change, the Great Recession and the economic fallout associated with it, we're seeing again with the pandemic. Also, Beck's work on kind of linking terrorist threats. This context, these questions about the nature of risk distribution and the logic of it, and the politics involved in it, have been a key focus of concern. Right, so we see then work kind of illustrating that kind of the architecture, the kind of outline of the world risk society really takes off in the post-World War II context, where there's a dramatic shift to production technologies, number of inorganic and synthetic material produced by humans, but which we don't really know the full impact of those risky technologies. And the long latency period of technological risks, it is said, diminishes the capacity of expert systems to determine accurate cause-effect relationships. And then there's a politics of risk that are linked to power and knowledge imbalances. And then from there, there's a proliferation of contested risk definitions. And so in this kind of, I mean, we can think about this as more of a postmodern kind of theory, right? That there's a breakdown in, capital T truths and what we commonly share and understand about the nature of risk. And there's a multiplicity of risk definitions in modernity. And what Beck often looks at is then the staging of risk and social construction of it and the manufactured uncertainties that we have, and much of the subpolitics about and how do we address the uncertainties about the risky technologies that are proliferating around us. But there's more to it that I'm going to be addressing in this talk and in my work more recently now is more on the social and spatial dimensions of it. And right, whereas Beck had initially articulated that, right, that as risky technologies and practices were being developed and becoming diffuse throughout the world, they still would kind of accumulate in the lower ends of the socioeconomic system or social stratification system. But then he argued as massive disasters that would then impact both place folks at risk and also impact them in catastrophic ways really happened, as he argued, irrespective of social and spatial position. So this is the social boomerang effect kind of idea. Right? The risk becomes spatially and socially diffuse and impacts the privileged and disadvantaged. The democratization of risk is these cosmopolitan moments that he writes about. We've seen some support for this, this claim here in Elliott and Frickel's study of land-based hazard waste accumulation in Portland, Oregon. Now that's in the context of them looking at really, right in this post-World War II period, what's the extent to which there's this accumulation of such hazardous waste, and comparing Portland, Philadelphia, Minneapolis, New Orleans. They find the Portland case is different from the others in that there is a social boomerang effect, that there's this distribution and accumulation over time of hazardous waste that's irrespective of the demographic composition of the neighborhoods they're looking at. Other work by Romero and Lecow et al., an article in Social Science Medicine, looked at the distribution of toxic air pollution amidst global environmental change in 3 Latin American cities and found that that there was this boomerang effect evident across these municipal districts in their study. But one thing that Beck returns to in his work on the World Risk Society is this idea of social vulnerability, right? It's defining here from his work. And really gets into kind of these key questions that he brings about that reiterate his focus on these unknown unknowns and uncertainties about risk. What constitutes vulnerability in particular contexts and how did this come about? Who or what is exposed to what danger, and how this context of threats can be traced back possibly across borders to the context of the decision makers. So while many focus on Beck's work and critique it for not attending to inequalities or vulnerabilities, he does kind of have this some of these statements in this 2009 work on the world at risk. But still, what stems from that then is more a focus on who are the decision makers, how is risk understood, and then still working in this idea of the sub-politics of risk. And what I want to do now is kind of bring in some research and that I've been a part of, most recently in a edited special issue, the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy, and Society, where we look at Riskscapes. And what I want to do now is present a talk where I provide, outline some of this agenda that I've been working on. I focus in particular on the need for such research, since future research along these lines, to be attentive to the central role that relational devaluation of colonized and racialized people and places plays in producing what I call high-risk neighborhoods in the front lines of current and future urban environmental crises. Right, we work in realms, many of in your department as well, where folks are working on either urban crises or what they consider climate or environmental crises, and we don't really look at their intersection. Right? So I'm conceptualizing that intersection as these urban environmental crises. The findings that I'll present from my Stockton case study I've been working on for quite some time illustrates that built on a foundation of indigenous colonization and erasure, different historical configurations of devalued racialized people and places, adverse housing market incorporation and displacement, and unequal flood protections are associated with elevated risk of exposure to climate-related sea level rise, what I call Stockton's high-risk neighborhoods. And in going over that work, I'm going to be drawing off of a number of scholars who are working in these different realms of sociological inquiry and also just critical social sciences related to urban environmental studies and racial theory, as well as settler colonial theory. And what I'm trying to do here is synthesize some really important insights that they've provided in disparate works to help us understand the intersecting nature of these urban environmental crises. So we have both from Beck thinking about social vulnerability as a cumulative concept, right, a historically driven phenomenon. We also get within work I've been engaging with over the years on cumulative impacts, right, where we're kind of thinking through the multiplicity of ways people are vulnerable to environmental hazards and threats, right? So we've seen that in the realm of public health, and we can talk more about that. What I'm highlighting here is a work that is more in the context of climate change and also in an international nature, and Letsichenko and O'Brien's double exposure framework. And what they talk about, they're really concerned with, right, how do we trace, first they put out their own research agenda, right, of really trying to understand the impacts of global environmental change and globalization and those impacts and outcomes at the more localized level. And really, how can we understand exposures? And they put forward this idea of contextual environments. I won't elaborate them all here, but they're listed, right? These kind of multiplicity of ways in which we we have these pathways for exposure, right? And they to separate and interacting stressors, right? And they argue that those contextual environments are key to really understanding the convergence and synergies of these broader global risks, right? We live in this supposed world risk society. How do we trace impacts to the local? We have to understand these exposure pathways, which can exacerbate pre-existing inequalities, vulnerabilities, and rates of change, and openings for responding positively to change. We've seen this also with Gotham and Greenberg when their analyses of uneven landscapes of risk and resilience in their work, and comparing both the production of disaster vulnerability and the natural experience of disaster and its outcomes, and the redevelopment initiatives that take the form of crisis-driven urbanization. So there's some parallel here, as I'm just noting this framework here. It's brought up often in global environmental change research. What we do in our special issue is develop this idea of riskscapes further, which actually goes back to work that was being conducted in the United States, often in the realm of environmental justice studies and public health. Rachel Morello-Frosch and her colleagues are pretty central in this regard. But then we have another strand of research outside the US that defines it more and thinking about riskscapes as a symbolic and material force, right, that can bring about the threat of loss and livelihoods to people across space and time. What I'm doing in my work is to think more so using the insights of urban sociology and environmental sociology and critical perspectives that really think about how risk gets concentrated. And so define this here as risky neighborhoods. And those I look at as places of relative high risk concentration within a given riskscape. And what I ultimately seek to understand, and this really overlaps, with this idea of double exposure or multiple exposures, as well as cumulative impacts that we get from public health and environmental justice studies, this idea of high risk neighborhoods. And define them as places of cumulative risk accumulation and interconnection across multiple riskscapes. And in the broader work, and we can talk more maybe in the Q&A, kind of the social construction of high risk neighborhoods, I bring that into the analysis, and we can think more about the implications of those insights in kind of refashioning some of Beck's ideas about the staging of risk, perhaps. And so in thinking about these particular neighborhoods of concentrated risk and interconnection across multiple riskscapes, I really draw off of critical race and urban theories that focus on uneven development, right? We understand uneven development as that spatial variation in affluence and poverty, right? So that's the spatial dimensions of inequality that we're often concerned with. And I draw off of work from the socio-spatial approach that looks at how uneven development is produced through multi-scalar interplay of culture and political economy, really, right? How people, the cultural aspect, how people and places are signified as different, and how those significations then drive political economic action in urban space. And that can be a scalar process, right? Both from the local all the way to the global and back again. What I focused in on in particular is racial categories that are used and mobilized in this context, and in such a way that they reflect racial projects, right? We understand racial projects as those, right, the way in which we engage in political action, as Omin Wanat articulated, that we use the way in which we signify people and human bodies differently can then be a political force, right, that can drive politics and also the inhabiting and creation and destruction, and then rearticulation of those racial categories. And as a process, we look at racialization, right, the extension of those racial categories to people and spaces, for example. And we know from research, right, that happens in a hierarchical ways, given the prevailing racial order and racial hierarchies, and that can then drive uneven development. To make uneven development, right, that spatial variation in affluence and poverty, a racialized process. It is structured by, right, the use of racial categories for then the purpose of redistributing or distributing resources along those racial lines. And from this work, I developed this idea of the relational racialization of space. And this is one thing that I'm focusing on throughout. It's kind of reflected in a lot of my work, but I really try to think, beyond what we've seen as a kind of binary black-white paradigm of studying race relations or even segregation and other spatial phenomenon in urban sociology, to really think about how, right, the type of unequal exposures or experiences and segregation, for example, that we see in urban space in forms of uneven development, really reflect, right, how groups are stratified by elites through the use of these racial categories. And we can't really understand them fully on their own terms. We can understand the, maybe the logics of the particular racial categories and how they're used. But to fully understand them, we need to attend to the relational manifestations and articulations. So that's part of a broader work on relational formations of race that's come out in 2019 in an edited volume by Molina, Hosang, and Gutierrez. But we see from this other strands of work that there's overlaps with other critical racial and settler colonial theories. And in particular, I highlight the work of Cedric Robinson, right, and who had articulated this idea of racial capitalism that's getting more attention these days, right, where we can define it plainly here for our purposes, this presentation, as rearticulations of racial inferiority and colonial regimes to structure capital accumulation. We can return back to that point later as well if we'd like. But also, what we see also these overlaps with Robinson's work and how he looks at the development of racial capitalism all the way back to feudal Europe, and then the expansion of that dynamic through imperial and colonial regimes. We see in the US context and also other settler colonial societies, right, where there are these foreign powers following that, worldwide expansion from Northwest Europe, imperialism, that the colonizers are there to stay, right? It's in contrast to maybe what we might see in world systems theory or other kind of colonial metaphors or theories, right, where perhaps there's the colonial regime is gone, right? And settler colonial societies, they're always there. It's ongoing. The US is still a settler colonial society, right? And the key here is, right, they're there to stay and rendering necessary, if unattainable, the erasure of indigenous lands and peoples as an ongoing project. And what I'm highlighting here with Blattman, Thomas, and Porter is then this has major implications for how we think about urban space, right? Particularly in settler societies as the pinnacle of the settler colonial context, right? Where urban space is about the intensification of land use. And we see that take on a particular form and dependent on property relations then to maintain that settler colonial order. It's a different kind of starting point for when we're thinking about the history and the production of space in settler societies, such as the US. Lastly, we can get to a synthesis then with and environmental justice studies and a lot of empirical research has brought this to light, where we might define the US as having a particular environmental racial formation, right? Where it's predicated on the ongoing project of erasure of indigenous lands and peoples, devaluation, segregation, unequal poisoning of Black, Latinx, and Asian bodies, urban industrial space. Then environmental privilege is concentrated in and among white bodies in homogenous spaces, right? That goes back to focus on, frankly, on white supremacy, right? And seeing and valuing most highly those residential settlements and real estate that are homogenous in improvements and composition and demographics, and particularly if they are predominantly white. Now, kind of plugging back into the context of climate change, right? And one thing that has been pointed out by, for example, Mueller-Mann and his colleagues is that sea level rise really exposes gaps in the world risk society model. They say sea level rise is a global problem, but is particularly severe for people living in coastal areas, right? So that gets into these ideas of physical vulnerability, place vulnerability. But we also know that those who are in floodplains or otherwise at high risk of sea level rise can very much be at the lower, very much be socially vulnerable as well. But not always, right? As we see some coastal areas, and many of you might be familiar with that on the East Coast, right? Right, that there are these prominent and elite settlements along the coastlines that are also succumbing to the hazards of sea level rise. And in the work that I'm drawing off in this presentation, I also say, right, that much of this work also needs to attend to race and racism and the heterogeneous spatial dynamics that structure social vulnerability of exposure to multiple risks in the context of global environmental change. Right, we tend to, depending on the methods we use, whether it be statistical and we look at average kind of patterns on, and results on the regression line, we may see the diversity of ways in which inequalities, vulnerabilities are produced and inequalities are experienced. Right? I know some of you in this here doing this presentation, Diane Seacott, you being one of them, you're well attuned to the importance of attending to these heterogeneous outcomes because they give us more specificity, right, to then think about production of vulnerability and inequalities. So what I'll do now is turn to the case study, right? And we've kind of been going over a lot of other work and theoretical work and provide some empirical insights here. And so this is my case is sea level rise and the production of high risk neighborhoods in Stockton. I'm drawing off of, in particular, two references here that are listed on the slide. My research questions, right, in a supposed world risk society, right, to what extent are climate, environmental, and economic risks similarly concentrated among social groups and physical space within a single metropolitan area? And I'm highlighting, climate, environmental, and economic because I'm really trying to look at this, develop this kind of initial schematic for thinking about multiple risk exposures and high risk neighborhoods and the interlocking of these riskscapes. And to what extent are such multiple risk exposures associated with neighborhood level race and class composition in urban development? Now, if you're familiar with my other work, I tend to do more intersectional work where I look at the intersection of race and class. But given some of the historical data I have, as well as my interest in really kind of honing in and anchoring the study of environmental inequalities, for example, in race, I'm focusing on the race and class composition rather than their intersection. And we can talk more about that if we'd like to in the Q&A. A couple additional key concepts I develop in this work is to specify what kind of riskscapes I'm talking about and really specify in relation to climate, environmental, and economic. And I focus here, I define a sea level rise riskscape as a spatial variation in human vulnerability and sea level rise exposure risk. But I define flood risk as a spatial variation in human vulnerability and flood exposure risk. And then, and the first two are kind of, we get those a little more implicitly within much of the disaster vulnerability as it relates to sea level rise and flood risk. Perhaps what's, I would say, maybe more novel is this development of the idea of housing riskscape as a spatial variation in human vulnerability and risk of adverse housing market incorporation and displacement. So what we're getting at there, right, is when we think about, for example, the Great Recession and work by Jesus Hernandez and other folks, looking at the progression from redlining, right, which is a sign of being adversely incorporated in the housing market, right, of being devalued as seen as an investment risk for neighborhoods given their demographic composition, to then the targeting of those same neighborhoods, not a one-to-one correspondence, but a pretty high level of correlation with subprime loans during the 2004-2006 subprime mortgage crisis, right? Which then, right, they were targeted then with these adverse loans and high interest rates and other kind of subpar kind of loan products and high risk loan products that then were highly correlated with people being displaced. And so, right, in thinking about that history and what many have already highlighted, we can define, right, housing riskscape as such, right, involving the adverse housing market incorporation, but also threat of displacement. Now, argue that this is a central contextual environment that intertwines risk exposures through, I'll say, relationally racialized uneven development, right? That when we think about one of the main institutions and institutional context by which people are sorted and sifted through space, it is through the housing market and housing markets in a way that, right, can really precondition our exposure to these other riskscapes. And also the way that the housing riskscape is then structured to bring in a way that, as I talk about in my work, brings in, right, the risk levels and the underwriting and mortgage insurance and everything that goes into housing market takes into consideration the biophysical environment and particularly flood risk, right? And increasingly so, we're seeing that with sea level rise risk. So we can see this tight coupling of these riskscapes empirically, and we have to take light of take that seriously when we think about understanding risk and studying it sociologically and spatially. So I focused on the Stockton case, right, because the flood risk and sea level rise exposure risk are unequally distributed. That's been established in research by those I draw on here, and long history of what they say flood fighting and flood exposure within Stockton. Stockton was devastated by the 2007-2009 housing crisis and Great Recession, and during that time period, whether it be Forbes or other kind of popular media and academic studies would rank Stockton as above, more impacted, more vulnerable, and a number of other urban crises associated with it, far above Detroit and other places that get a lot of study within urban sociology. It's also established as a highly segregated metropolitan area. The metropolitan area is San Joaquin County. Right, authoritatively telling us what we already know, 2000 census says Stocktonians live in racially segregated neighborhoods. This is a excerpt from a quote from a journalist in Stockton. Despite decades in the so-called melting pot, highly diverse metropolitan region and city, Stockton's north side is mostly white. The south side is mostly Latino and Black. Southeast Asians live clumped up in ethnic enclaves. Martin Luther King had a dream. It wasn't Stockton. My research strategy, I'll summarize this briefly. In this work, I've been drawing off of archival data from 1850 to 2010. What I'll be presenting here is analysis of estimated sea level rise exposure risk for 139 census tracts in the metropolitan area. And then I use content analysis, qualitative comparative analysis, or QCA, and geographic information systems, or GIS, to uncover diverse pathways to sea level rise exposure risk. And in so doing, I'm really then using that as an avenue through which to understand the production of these high risk neighborhoods and the diverse conditions that contribute to that heightened risk of exposure across multiple riskscapes. And here's a figure from that work where I'm showing where Stockton is located in California, and drawing off of other scholars who have modeled sea level rise exposure risk throughout the continental United States. I have that shown here in map B. But one thing that's limited in that work, and that they even note in some of this research, is that the modeling of that SLR risk of exposure, it doesn't include local levee conditions. And so what I did was mine archives and reports from U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and their determination of unacceptable levees. And those are the levees that are mostly in the terms of being structurally unacceptable, right? If they have hollowing out or burrowing, which really speaks to kind of the degree of investment and upkeep by institutional authorities of those levees. Or are they unacceptable from encroachments, right? That people are voluntarily developing up on those levees and impairing them in some way. And when you lay those onto those projections, then we find that there's only a few neighborhoods within, or census tracts within Stockton that I show here in map C that are both vulnerable exposure to sea level rise and also exhibit this unacceptable levee adjacency. So getting into the results, what I'm doing across these work, and I should say I've been kind of, this stemmed from my dissertation, it seems like a long time ago, and kind of putting together different parts of the analysis. And so part of this is now the kind of outline of a book that I'm working on, where I also bring in interviews that I have been doing over the years and seeking to pick up again, whenever that's feasible. But what I'm presenting here is just archival insights. I can speak to then how some of those interviews relate to some of these findings. But one, the historical research, we find that the lands and lives of many of Stockton's Miwok and Yokut tribal members were taken, right, with the early settlement of Stockton. And that it's symbolized in the landscape. And there's a river called Calaveras River that that's featured in some of the analysis that was one that has been fortified over time, and a lot of flood fighting has occurred around this river, just the north, in what is now north central Stockton. But when the fur trappers were initially coming in the 1830s into the Stockton area, and then the Mexican land grant was then given over, and former military officer and settler and German immigrant Charles Weber had been one of the main settlers in developing Stockton. During that time, the fur trappers and other settlers were remarking on the wake of that indigenous erasure project. And using the term Calaveras, if you're familiar with that in Spanish, right? It's a Spanish word, and in English it means skulls. And they use that term, just reflecting on the impact of the epidemics and the project of indigenous erasure that had unfolded within the area. So you see that name bearing that indigenous erasure project. And some of the analysis I've done, looking at some of the more prestigious, or I should say more desirable and sought after real estate within Stockton, finds that there's no American Indians as of 2000 that reside in those elite, that's a green graded University of the Pacific neighborhood. It's a really prime real estate around the University of the Pacific in Stockton that has been fortified with racially restrictive covenants over time, and is near Calaveras River, and that's where Stockton's indigenous folks were removed and killed, and to the point where they are seen as erased mostly from the landscape. And so when I move forward here, and I have some interview data that then reflects on some of these experiences from indigenous folks within Stockton. What I'm going to do then is transition to discussing more of the racialized groups who are more predominant in Stockton, and who are their concentrations more commonly associated with elevated risk of exposures to multiple risks and high-risk neighborhoods. The analysis, I know I have a lot going on in this slide. In my GIS classes, I wouldn't advocate for students to be putting so much in a map. But this one is from that a book chapter on relational and racialization of space work I do in Stockton, where I use this to kind of do a lot in the context of a chapter. And so what I've done here is I mapped out using Sanborn fire insurance maps, the racial ethnic establishments that were shown in the 1917 maps. And what was the thing that was interesting at that time is that what we think is white ethnic establishments, as well as those are more now well outside the racialized white boundaries in Stockton, were demarcated on those maps. We can talk more about Sanborn fire insurance maps were for, but one thing you get is that in the surveyors putting out the listing out the fire risks is that they were labeling these racial and ethnic establishments. And so we see early on in the early industrial land uses right around downtown Stockton that those who are largely outside the German British kind of power and elite during this time period were demarcated as different and located within the urban industrial space. And as you fast forward then through the 1930s, when the Homeowners Loan Corporation was conducting their residential security surveys throughout 239 US cities, and bringing in their interviews from real estate agents and local real estate officials to develop their risk appraisals. I'm showing here in the darkest shades, those that were redlined. And you can see in the analysis I look at, okay, what are kind of what's commonly associated with that redlining status? We find that it's mostly those neighborhoods that had deed restrictions put in place, that is, say, racially restrictive covenants, and near urban industrial space that were demarcated as hazardous, right? That fourth grade redline neighborhoods. And they're located mostly in Stockton's south side and in areas along Mormon Channel that had experienced floods. Chinese who had been particularly targeted in Stockton along the West Coast were often pushed into camps and labor camps along the Mormon Channel that was flooding, right? And so Stockton's south side became a tightly intertwined landscape of where flood risks were unequally distributed, urban industrial hazards were unequally distributed, and amongst those who most predominantly ended up constituting people of color classifications within Stockton, and also low-income areas. So you see, even in the 1930s, some of the red-lined or yellow-lined areas, the C third grade areas, brought in displaced farmers from the Midwest who were white working class folks as well. And that had also been subjected to adverse housing market incorporation. Italians were also kind of outside that barrier. But as Italians, as kind of an example of Southeast Europeans who were able to be incorporated in that white category and became elite through their work in the agricultural sector and the cherries farming in particular, right, rose to prominence and were provided access into these racially restricted neighborhoods, all that were put in place around the University of the Pacific that was cited there in the 1930s. So you see this infrastructure being put in place early on. Elite neighborhoods in North Stockton along that Calaveras River where indigenous folks had been erased. And then the other spaces east and south Stockton were left for those who were racially and economically disadvantaged. What were some of the outcomes then? Then we see, fast forward in the 1950s, there was this disastrous flood. They call it the Christmas 1955 flood. That when there was this atmospheric river event and extreme downpours of rain burst a nearby dam and sent floodwaters rushing towards Stockton, came in through the Mormon Channel that had a history of flooding and devastated Stockton's south side. The newspaper folks remarking on it said it turned South Stockton into Venice. And more recently, people compared it as having, on par devastation of what we saw in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina. But floodwaters were also going, during this time, I should say that there was urban renewal initiatives that were put in place, which, as you recall, the redlined areas were in South Stockton and the East Side. Much of that urban renewal initiatives were put in place to then destroy those communities. And in part, they impaired floodways, particularly Mormon Channel, by paving over and putting in parking lots. And so while floodwaters went through the diverting canal, out Calaveras River, and out to sea, or at least out to the San Joaquin River, and then out to the Bay Delta estuary, much of the impaired flood protections channeled water through South Stockton. And so what I show here in this analysis is then those areas that were redlined and the extent to which then they were, they're seen as having high flood risk in the past. This kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That they were seen as risky investments and not to protect them. And then they were slated for urban renewal and destruction, and then they were destroyed in part through this flood. And that very mapped on into the prevailing racial and class hierarchies. And so transitioning here, and I've seen getting close on time, but we're nearing an end. Right then, so I look at that in my analysis and then kind of a way to think, sorry, it's my alarm. Right, okay, so there's the inscription of these hierarchies and then the solidification of them we see from 1970s to 2010. And so the analysis I take through, and just kind of showing it here on some of these maps, I look at then a couple developments that happened. So through the 1970s, we saw increasing focus on stopping redlining, right? Through the succession of Fair Housing Acts in previous eras, we get to the 1970s, and then there's analyses done within California and all throughout the United States that undergird some of the fair housing legislation in the Community Reinvestment Acts in the 1970s, where we see that they produce these analyses of redlining that was unfolding then. And our purposes here will just map A. The darker areas are those that were basically being redlined. They call them mortgage deficient areas. And I'm showing both in map A, B, and C here the Stockton Unified School District boundaries. And so in 1970, at the start of this decade, then there had been initiatives to desegregate Stockton schools, and then a judge declaring that they in fact were being segregated. And so then they put in a desegregation order from 1970 to 2000. And so I'm overlaying Stockton Unified School District here as a salient kind of boundary for what was then seen as a hazardous space. So we get from redlining in earlier areas, and even in the 1970s, to then the expansion of that hazardous space to the boundaries of Stockton Unified School District. And during this time period, we see that going into the 2000s, map B here, darker areas, above average levels of subprime loans being concentrated, mostly within Stockton. And then foreclosures, I'm showing them here as default to residence ratio. So higher ratio, meaning more defaults in relation to residences there in homes. And what happens during this time period is that there is increasing white and capital flight from Stockton Unified School District boundaries up to the Lodi school districts and out to the expanses. And so I talk about that in my work and how that really reflects kind of the solidification of these risk and race race, class, and spatial hierarchies during this time period. And then the demographics then, what do we see? Map A, we see above average concentration of Latinx population in 2010 within Stockton Unified School District and in the flood prone Delta Islands. Map B, percent Asian, we see those Asian enclaves throughout the metropolitan area. Above average percent Black population, we see also in Stockton's South Side, but in other select areas of the metropolis. And then average median household income, right? We see the dark areas being below average. We see much of Stockton during this time period, which incorporates the effects of the Great Recession and the Delta Islands. And so what you're seeing here, there's not this perfect one-to-one correspondence. We're seeing these shifting geographies across these different realms and different risks. The task then, how do we show how they come together? And I can return back to the slide and question, our discussion perhaps. What I do then is qualitative comparative analysis. Is this crisp set approach where I look at, the presence or absence of these conditions and the extent to which they're associated with sea level rise exposure risk, which it's my main dependent variable. But as I'm looking at the confluence of these different contemporary race and class vulnerabilities and the racialized uneven development and multiple risk exposure, I'm looking at then the layering of an interaction of these riskscapes, of these flood riskscapes, housing riskscapes, and then the sea level rise riskscapes over time. And really kind of these indicators I come up with here for racialized uneven development. And I'll note one of the main, we might say it's going on the order of a necessary condition, but what I find is that they're in all of these different kind of recipes that are produced, recipes of risk, or these QCA solutions. And again, I can talk more about what those mean in terms of the intermediate solutions. Is that the across these neighborhoods, these that are forecasted to be elevated risk of exposure to sea level rise, is that they have above average Black composition. So that's consistent across them. But we see is that there's these different combinations that come together and that they are very consistent. And I can again go back to the slide to help interpret that. But just showing the value of this approach, right, that we see QCA solution 1 relates to the Boggs Tract neighborhood here, as well as some of these, I would say, North Seaport and Weston Ranch, and also North and, I should say, West and East Weston Ranch. Right, above average levels of Asian and Black residents, a history of adverse housing market incorporation through being redlined, and also subprime loans being concentrated there, and displacement with foreclosures. And involuntary imposed risky flood protection. So that is to say that they have these levees that were deemed unacceptable because of structural reasons. Then on the north side, we see above average levels of Asian and Black residents and encroachments that contributed to nearby levee instability by the 2008-2010 period, and elevated vulnerability of exposure within the flood riskscape. Boggs Tract, and again, what's useful with this approach is that we're finding these plausible, sufficient conditions, these combinations of conditions that are associated with this outcome. And so it helps us define and identify these diverse pathways of exposure. Another explanation for the Boggs Tract neighborhood could be that it has a contemporary status as a diverse, non-white and low-income area, and an intertwining history of racialized risk of adverse housing market incorporation and involuntarily imposed risky flood protections. And the final QCA solution, one we see here that what used to be a very privileged neighborhood in Stockton, but then it was within that Stockton Unified School District that was going under desegregation orders, and people were leaving, seeing it as a threat to their real estate investments, and also where they were going to establish and continue their lives and community formation. Extensions of encroachments that have impaired local levee quality, right? And so that they're mostly like boat docks and other kind of things that people had developed a while ago had then impaired the levee infrastructure. And following that white and capital flight, that neighborhood then had above average levels of Black folks and low income households. So again, this kind of just speaks to, right, the value of this approach, right, that we may have, social vulnerability analyses, which are fine and well and are illuminating and thinking about statistically, right, how we can create these composite indexes, for example, of vulnerability to exposure to different types of risk. But often those analyses aren't looking at the intersection of these risks, and also in these composite kind of indices that we find and use in social vulnerability mapping, for example, we miss the diversity of outcomes, right? We lose also history when we see that the production of these high risk neighborhoods from the analysis are very much historically driven and involve in-depth understanding of colonization and colonized and devalued racialized people of color within the Stockton metropolitan area. So I went over there a little bit. That's what I have. I'd be happy to talk more. I had to go through some of this pretty quickly. I'm happy to revisit some points and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raoul. That was really fascinating. I'd like to open this up for questions from folks. And there are a couple ways you could ask questions. One, you can drop a question in the chat if you're not able to speak directly, and I'll moderate and read your question. Alternatively, you can either physically raise your hand on video or raise your hand by going to the participants tab on Zoom, hovering over more, 3 dots, little gray dots, more, and there's a raise hand button. I'm not give you that instructions. It seems like there might be a simpler way than that. If you can go ahead and raise your hand, and I will create a stack if we have multiple questions and guide folks through that process. So I saw Diane's hand already. So Diane, go ahead and get us started.
Okay, so this was very, very interesting throughout. And so there's a lot of interesting ideas to discuss, but there was one in particular that really stood out for me, and that is the idea of relational formations of race and relationally racialized uneven development. So can you say more about both of those ideas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in to plug the book, I think there's a lot of great chapters in it. It's this one here. Okay. That my chapter is number, I think, 8 in there, and there's really excellent works, and a lot of it, stems from work that Laura Polito, who's a fantastic colleague, and we're fortunate to have here at UO, but many others, Natalia Molina and folks who have really been looking at the and engaging with Omiwanot's racial formation theory, and really, as Polito had put it in 2006, this really great study of, I'm trying to remember the full title of it, Black, Brown, Yellow, and Left, I think, radical activism in Los Angeles. I'm not getting the title completely correct, but that's pretty close. And so she has this really great work on really just thinking about racial formation and racial projects as relational. And Natalia Molina does as well, and Dan Hosang, is at Yale now, who we had at UO. And I had been kind of working on this stuff and presented some of that. One of those maps in draft form was in my dissertation, where I was looking at really how these racial hierarchies were being inscribed in space in Stockton. And I found, and even then going into the HLLC residential security surveys, and how they're valuing green, blue, yellow, red neighborhoods. Often we find, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, sorry, but so I'll get to that point in a minute. But back to Polito and Molina and folks, they that they argue and convincingly show in their own work that we can't really understand the experiences and racial formation process within a white-black paradigm, nor can we fully understand the experiences of various Latinx groups or Asian folks without understanding the broader kind of white-black paradigm, right? And so a fuller picture comes to light when we look at how racial categories are deployed relationally. And in so doing, then we see the establishment of racial hierarchies by elites. We see which groups are seen as threats during particular time periods. In my chapter, a key insight, and it comes out in more recent work, is this anti-Black racism in Stockton, which, to use Polito's words, reflects the national racial narrative that we've had in the U.S., right? But we see that can happen contingently at the local levels, and that is contingent on the racial order locally, right? What's the extent to which that racial narrative maps on and relates and resonates with white supremacist elites locally and in relation to other dimensions of racial power that are expressed locally. But that has specific spatial manifestations. And it really comes to light, I mean, through my dissertation and thereafter, and that's what I look at in my book chapter is in particular the HULC residential neighborhood appraisals, is it's all dependent on, the grades are dependent on those neighborhoods around them and within the city, right? So you can't understand fully the metrics and the way in which redlining was targeted in Stockton South Side and East Side without understanding the elite green line neighborhoods around the University of the Pacific, and then the intermediary categories in between, because you go through those surveys and they talk about it. You know, it's not, they would say the appraisers and you know, it's dependent on their interviews with local real estate officials, which gets into this in more detail, is that, well, this place isn't as bad as those other places, right? Right? And so it's fundamentally relational. And we know that as, right, spatial statisticians, that this idea of spatial dependence, what, you know, things that are closer together are more commonly alike than those that are farther apart. And that's what you see in the residential security surveys. And then we see that in doing spatial statistics. And so what I kind of have been writing about more in drawing on my other work, but just these insights about spatial dependence, is that the racialization process is spatially dependent. And so it's kind of a convergence of these ideas, putting them together, and that drives uneven development, that makes racialized uneven development relational. And it's, as I'm putting this, I guess, in jargony words, but, you know, I talk with real estate agents and you see it all over. It's like location, 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 but it's always location in relation to other locations within your study area. And those valuations are dependent on how we make sense of racial categories and who lives where and the racial composition of those neighborhoods. And so that's what I'm getting at there. And one thing that's interesting then is that we see this with, you know, the broader kind of book I've been writing, you know, drafting this more, is, right, you go back to the salience of biophysical environments and the built environment to signify these differences, whether it be, you know, references to the other side of the tracks, or we go back to the Venice ghetto, and, right, it was about putting Jewish folks near the foundry in Ghetto Nuovo, an urban industrial hazard, to, you know, right? And so manufacturing facility, and that was to help signify their devalued status. And so I think, and so I bring that into that chapter, and that's what I've been really kind of thinking through the book project then, is that really can help us understand the formation of these environmental inequalities. And I'm not the first to say that, right? That Lauro Polito and David Pell and so many others, and your own work, Diane, in Philadelphia, right? I think, you know, in terms of you talking about place stratification, I think it's, that's kind of what I'm getting at, is kind of building on all this other great work too.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Mimi Scheller, and then Juan Vargas can go. Go ahead, Mimi.
Hey, thanks. Thanks, Raoul. That was just a great talk and really exciting work. And I especially love the way you're doing all the, you know, the mapping and the kind of technical spatial work, but you're also drawing on a really deep field of theory, you know, from racial capitalism to risk society that you started us with, to develop this concept of racially uneven development. The question it brought me to was that it seems like when you focus on spatial distributions of risk and vulnerability, and you're showing this kind of complex racialization of it, it kind of seems to come to a question of distributive justice, right? Like what the distribution of risks and vulnerabilities to those risks is played out on this kind of spatial map with different moving parts. But that left me thinking, well, where then would be the story about other dimensions of justice? So procedural justice and participatory justice, and the ability of some groups, as you said, to be like the decision makers, and people who can choose to move and can choose to be in the green areas aren't there's like a lot of politics around that. I heard someone recently say, like, we talk a lot about the social determinants of health, but Charles Brown says, what about the political determinants of health? So these are like political processes of power. Who has power?
Mm-hmm.
But then to take it back to the world, the risk society, then, and the boomerang effect, some of those wealthier or whiter or decision-making people may choose to move away, right, altogether. And let's say to go live in the hills, in a beautiful, more natural, wildernessy area where they get struck by fires, right,
Mm-hmm.
in the risk society. So isn't there still a kind of ultimate boomerang effect, maybe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I've thought a lot about those things, and in being in Eugene, I mean, and we've had the fires and everything, and so it's affecting people in the hills, and these kind of points. Yeah, so that last one that resonates here pretty well. So a couple of things I've been thinking about this, and again with the data I have, a couple of ways. So one in terms of procedural justice, my earlier work looked at the institutionalization of environmental justice in California state government. And so I published a little bit on that and kind of how, right, even under, I mean, it was a Schwarzenegger regime, so it was kind of pretty conservative still. But that, right, very market oriented. But one thing that happened during his tenure was that there had been all these environmental justice initiatives that had been put in place that really tried to open the door for procedural justice. Right? So this is kind of the flip side of your question. Right? I'm talking about a lot of distributive stuff here. On that work, it was really the politics, the policy making, who has authority to speak for who, questions about representation and authority and legitimacy. And even when that environmental justice groups had unprecedented access to decision-making processes in terms of being advisory committees and things like that. The unequal distributions were still unfolding, right? So distributive justice in no means at all followed procedural justice in that way. So and then thinking, like what I've been looking at here in Stockton, that these distributed injustices, right? Even with then, and this is kind of what I've been catching up more right after like getting tenure, and I can feel like finishing projects and going back to a lot more of the qualitative work in Stockton. They had Michael Tubbs. They had more of a, we might say, a progressive regime put in place. They have, he was a Stanford grad. He's from Stockton, very young, and identifies as Black, and had put in place a living wage experiment, right? And so what they're finding then is there's still these inequalities, right? That even with greater access to decision making, like he provide more context for disadvantaged South Side to be brought in into decision making, and he was listening to them and trying to target investments and those kind of things. But then then we still see, and this is what I'm catching up on thinking about future directions, is the pandemic really hitting the South Side hard in Stockton and throughout rural San Joaquin County. And so I don't really know what to do with those distributive justice questions. Like, what would it look like? Would it be justice if everyone was exposed? Or, right, this gets into like precautionary kind of approaches, right? Do we just get it all out of this, all these risks out of the system so that no one gets it? Right, because it wouldn't really be just if then you start just making everyone get it. And so I don't know what to say. I think in terms of the data, though, some of the qualitative work and the interviews that I did, I've still been analyzing. We're then looking at how folks tried to come together and bridge difference, particularly when like the urban renewal and the school desegregation orders had just really put everyone back in their corners. Like people who were from North and South Stockton, their kids were going to school together, right? And there was progressive parents who were like, yes, like let's do this, right? Let's address all these problems. And then that still didn't work just because of how enduring that racial hierarchies are and that systems of power in place. Like they just went back to their corners. And one thing, and kind of when the question I had in those interviews a lot, and I've still been thinking through and analyzing them, was what like when we're attending to these different riskscapes, right? Because you're dealing with all these multiplicity of these crises that people are confronting. What do they, right? If they're not going to, there's not going to be a redistribution of them. If there's not kind of some building of this cross-race, cross-class alliances, what do they focus on? And one thing that came to light, and that seems to be a theme as I'm continuously going back to these interviews, is that people were just coalescing around the basic necessities around food. Because the other thing I look at is food deserts in Stockton, and it's like it's in the bread capital of the United States and some say the world in terms of agricultural production, but there's massive amounts of food insecurity and starvation. And but then they can coalesce around that. But going deeper into it, they were channeled into that kind of advocacy for grants and other kind of stuff around food justice and nutritional justice. And so I'm pessimistic. I'm trying to like see, you know, with the data, what folks are saying in terms of spaces of hope, if we're using David Harvey's kind of language, that they might see to address these spatial issues. But a lot of it's just the ongoing exacerbation of these inequalities and reproduction of them. And so the like Lefebvrean answer, or like the Marxist one, right? I mean, being Marxist was, you know, you could change the mode of production. And so you can't change the distribution if you don't change the mode of production. So what would that look like? I think is the question. And those kind of questions are coming about. We think that we might have, you know, in our circumstances now, opportunities to ask them, but we still see the exacerbation of inequalities, right? Billionaires getting richer, and right, Indigenous folks, Latinx folks, and Black folks being hit hard by the pandemic. And so, yeah, I don't know. Thank you. That's a great question. I think that wakes me up at night sometimes.
All right, Juan Vargas, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, Dr. Liévanos. I really appreciated kind of your breakdown of this idea of riskscapes and high-risk neighborhoods and risky neighborhoods. And it kind of got me thinking about, you know, how the concept of risky neighborhoods is used for the purpose of policing. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to maybe if there's any clear connections between riskscapes and things like rising sea levels and policing, and how we might begin to examine or explore the role of policing within riskscapes. Mm-hmm. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's one of the, like on the to-do list. So part of like this type of research is like this never-ending data chase, right? So this is why I earned my doctorate in 2013, and I remember my committee like, you got to stop collecting data. And so I've been like chipping away at that. But, you know, one thing I've been wanting to do is then look at, because Stockton is also, particularly around the Great Recession, was deemed one of the most miserable cities in the United States. And that was very much because of its crime and also the construction. You know, being a sociologist, and I was doing field work there at the time, was very much talking with folks and within the Stockton South Side mostly, who they're like, we're seen as the risks. Our neighborhood are seen as the risks. We don't want to go outside sometimes, you know, because we're also having to deal with legitimate concerns about violent crime, but also police scrutiny, right? And so the way I've kind of been getting into that, at least in this part of the research, was really looking at how the neighborhoods where risks are, you know, being concentrated within these riskscapes are also conceptualized by elites as risky investments, right, through redlining. In other kind of investments, they're not putting flood protections in place, right, or they're not providing, you know, other investments to protect the lives and livelihoods of those neighborhoods. And I suspect, right, that would, and my interview data suggests that translates into how the police in Stockton also see these at-risk neighborhoods. They see them as risky to the prevailing racial and class order. That's something I've been wanting to explore, but in terms of bounding the work. But my interview data seems to be, as I'm unpacking that more so, seems to reflect like the impression that that these mean, it might be better to say at-risk neighborhoods, are seen as risky to elites locally, and that translates into heightened police scrutiny. And this would, my time in Philly, like, I mean, there's clear parallels, right? And I mean, Dan, you can speak to that more, but with near the just remembering the geography, right? South Philly, and right, of thinking about, I mean, that reminds me a lot, I mean, of doing, kind of going around and learning more about Philadelphia when I was there, but then at the same time I was doing field work in Stockton. I just saw so many parallels between similar spaces in Stockton and Philadelphia. And yeah.
All right, other questions?
Seeing some in the chat. I don't know if I missed North or West Philly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to monopolize, but if nobody else wants to go.
Go for
Did
it.
you? Okay. I was very curious. There's so much, you have so much data there, but I did pick up on one thing you said. You did say there was some kind of industrial canal in Stockton. Is that correct?
It's a diverting canal, and so it's a lot of, because I mean, flood. It's if you looked it up, if I did a if I wasn't working in grayscale on my maps, it's just the waterways are numerous, and so there's been flood risks there for ages, and so the Mormon Channel was one that had been paved over. It was a flood control channel, and that's the one that was going through South Side, and they paved over during urban renewal, and then it really devastated the South Side, and reflected kind of the unequal flood protection during that time. And then the diverting channel takes waters away from that, takes it up to Calaveras River, and then gets it around like the more privileged, or north side, and then around downtown. But they just let floods kind of come in on the south side, but that south side is also very industrial.
Okay, so this isn't an industrial canal like the one they have in New Orleans. This is more of a kind of a combined sewer overflow type canal.
Yeah, for flood control. There is the Port of Stockton, which goes right into downtown, and that takes heavy shipping traffic out to San Joaquin River, and then out to the Bay Delta into San Francisco. And that's been, I mean, there's a really good book on, I remember the name of it. Karen O'Neill, though, looked at the origins of U.S. flood control policy and compares in detail Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, which Stockton is in the heart of, to the Mississippi Delta. And so, in terms of just how influential the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have been in channeling the waterways in both areas, and then we see what happened, right, with Katrina and Murgo, but then that's a kind of a different story. That didn't happen as much in Stockton. It's more of these kind of just really, it's not that type of heavy shipping canal and the levees around it like we see in New Orleans. It's these really kind of divested flood control channels throughout Stockton that really then have channeled floodwaters and then sea level rise risk into Stockton South Side.
It's all really fascinating to me, just how all of this developed and the racism that was baked into it from the first day.
Can I ask a question to build on this? Actually, I've been thinking about the infrastructure of this all, and I'm curious about what potential is there for like infrastructural mitigation of these risks? Is there a sense of, I guess, also building on Mimi, both Mimi and Juan's questions about the politics of it? Is there like political energy or interest in adjusting like the physical landscape to mitigate some flood risk or some of the environmental hazards of this region? Or is that just not a political or economic priority for folks in charge?
Yeah, I mean, there has. I mean, and so in that article, kind of giving an update to those areas. So following 2010 and the Brown administration, in California had, and also with the Obama administration, they had really targeted infrastructure investments into the levee infrastructure locally and to secure it. And so some of those unacceptable levies had been improved a little bit. But then one thing, and this is like the next stage, more data, the next stage of it was really then, as soon as those were being put in place, those were also coupled with mandates to get flood insurance under the flood insurance program. And then that skyrocketed some of the, just the living costs for people living in those at-risk areas. And so, and then that's in the wake of following the Great Recession. And so, and then following that, then there's these mandates for sustainable community plans all throughout California, which Stockton's been grappling with. And I don't have a clear sense as to how they've been using that. And then there's this other work I've been doing on cumulative impact mapping with CalEnviroScreen, and that data, right? So California EPA uses all their data they have to map out where the most environmental health hazards are concentrated, and then its correlation with socially vulnerable groups. And elsewhere I've shown how to like take that apart and put it back together to do kind of environmental inequality analyses. One thing that they do with that mapping is then they find places that are most disadvantaged, and then they redirect climate revenues from climate auction proceeds into, and they redistribute them into places that are identified as most disadvantaged throughout the state. And so one thing I've been looking then to try to figure out how to plug this into analysis, because this will get to this question, I think, right, going back to me, has got me remembering plans to do this before the pandemic, was to then, like, you can look at where those investments are being concentrated and the extent to which, and they're coded on what those investments go into. Because in some areas, they've actually been towards like ameliorating some of those environmental health hazards. But in other places, it looks like that's also just beautification and gentrification projects. And what I've been wanting to do is get that all put together, because there's now, I think at least like 5, 6, 7 years worth of data to then look at where those investments have been concentrated, because Stockton South Side shows up as highly impacted. And so I could see, what those investments were going to, but I think that would be probably, in terms of the spatial justice or distributive justice question and infrastructure kind of stuff, where I can tease that out, but I haven't done that analysis yet.
That sounds fascinating. I'm going to probably tap you a little bit later on that, just to learn more about that side of the project. That sounds really
cool. There's so much. I mean, the benefits, but in hazards, we're working with like California data, as there's so much of it. They're producing is so much of it, and it's kind of a nice, privileged problem to have. And man, I think I remember talking with you previously just how much work it took for you to get all your Philadelphia data. So
I saw, Courtney's hand up. We just have a few minutes left. Let's see, maybe I saw. All right, any last questions before we wrap up, just in 2 minutes?
Me again. I just think that one of the things that I'm really focused on these days is labor. Mm-hmm. And I love Laura Polito's concept of the racialization of labor, because mm-hmm. it's so wonderfully flexible. Mm-hmm. It explains the cases of people of color being sort of segregated near hazardous industry. And it also explains working class whites mm-hmm. being in segregated white polluted neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. So did you find that racialization of labor was a factor in Stockton's Riskscape? Yeah,
I mean, I tend to that more in the book chapter, but that's like the...
Okay, I got to read that.
Yeah, I was... but not in a whole lot of detail, right? And so in terms of thinking about like, because in terms of the spatial analyses and things, it's like working with the limited data. And so of the census, as you know, right? And, but
Yes.
I could get at it for some years, but there's other, like I can get county level data. So for the whole metropolitan area as to what different racialized groups, what their labor positions were. And I know some of it also from other work. So I cite, you know, the Mexican Americans, the predominant Latinx group in Stockton that is predominantly working within the agricultural sector and the major agricultural area. And so I talk about them, you know, in terms of that's their positionality within it. And then my understanding of what census data I've been able to crunch thus far is that with Stockton's Black population, as we've seen in other metropolitan regions, very much concentrated in industrial labor sectors and public sector jobs, but then those get eroded with the erosion of the public sector and then their manufacturing being heavily impacted. It's been, and then with, I focus on, I didn't get it all in this talk, but there's a very complex story with Stockton's different Asian groups and particularly very different experiences between Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinx folks, where Filipinx folks have been often working in the agricultural sector and living in the Stockton South Side. And so when you take it apart by the different ethnic backgrounds of who's been racialized as Asian American in Stockton, those from the Philippines and Philippine descent they're very much on, like their experiences reflect the experiences of Mexican American and Black folks in Stockton, and that they're in service sector jobs and those kind of things. But that's I haven't attended that near as much detail as I've had the other analyses, but I have a general sense of how that's unfolded in Stockton. And then it's been different for, as I was alluding to, in the agricultural sector with like the Italians becoming a very prominent within the cherry farming sector. And that helped them also, that coincided with their kind of incorporation into that expanding white boundary in Stockton. That has really, from its founding, very much been kind of a prominent place for Stockton's folks who are from German and British descent.
With an eye on time, we should stop there. I put into the chat the open access introduction to the special issue that you participated in, Raoul. It's a fantastic intro to the kind of the broader research agenda of Riskscapes. So for folks who want to read a little bit more, that's available.
I can, and then I have my article available for free download too. I think I can put that, because I don't know that anyone not too many people have that journal subscription at their institutions.
Yeah, I would love to read that. I would love to read everything.
Me too.
Let's see, I can go, I should have the link on it. Sorry, I'm trying to do this quickly here. Okay, this should be it.
Great, thanks for sharing it. It'll be great to have that as a resource.
Let's see, sorry. All right. Yeah, so that should give you the free access to my article, my solo authored one.
Great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is
Thank you.
Thank
really
you.
appreciate the opportunity. It's great to see you all, and yeah, it's kind of a coming of home for sorts. 2011 was 10 years ago. It's been a while.
Well, maybe next time we see each other, it'll be safe to go out and get something to eat or something.
Yes, that'd be great. Yeah, absolutely.
Venture out into the Riskscape.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Thank you so much. I'll stop the recording.